So today I'd like to talk about communism and the related question of socialism. The fact of the matter is that a lot of people are feel very positive about Marxism. And the reason they feel so positive about Marxism and react with surprise, if not outright displeasure at hearing that I am a strong anti-Marxist and that I advocate egalitarianism as something which is fundamentally different from socialism and communism. The reason people are surprised at that, and maybe even strong disagreement with me about that, is, I believe, because they agree with a lot of very wonderful ideas that they have heard initially expressed by Marxists. Well, there are indeed a lot of very good ideas that I agree with that have been typically expressed most assertively, most explicitly by Marxists. So before telling you why I'm not a Marxist, let me at least talk about some of these good ideas that I agree with. And I want to make the point that these ideas were in existence long before Karl Marx was writing. In many cases, long before he was even born. And I think a lot of people are not aware of that, and they sort of think that it was Karl Marx who came up with these ideas, and therefore they say that's why I'm a Marxist. So I'm going to have to rely on my own book now to get this started. So let's see if I can do this without too much of a problem. Okay. Here are some of the great ideas that were around long before Karl Marx. The idea of class conflict. Class conflict is an idea that you can read about in the writings of Gerard Winstanley. Gerard Winstanley was born in 1609. Let me just remind you, Karl Marx was born on May 5th, 1818, and his first piece of writing was his doctoral thesis in 1841. So class conflict was talked about by Gerard Winstanley, who was born in 1609. He said, "And we look upon that freedom promised to be the inheritance of all, without respect of persons, and this cannot be unless the land of England be freely set at liberty from proprietors and become a common treasury to all her children. So long as the earth is entangled and appropriated into particular hands and kept there by the power of the sword, so long the creation lies under bondage. For though you and your ancestors got your propriety by murder and theft, and you keep it," and he's talking now to the ruling elite, "and you keep it by the same power from us that have an equal right to the land with you, by the righteous law of creation, yet we shall have no occasion of quarreling as you do about that disturbing devil called particular propriety. For the earth, with all her fruits of corn, cattle, and such like, was made to be a common storehouse of livelihood to all mankind, friend and foe without exception." That's also, in those words, you hear the property is theft idea long before Karl Marx was born. The idea, the famous phrase, from each according to ability to each according to need, which is associated with Karl Marx, well, that was a phrase that initially came as early as 1775. The Frenchman named Morelli wrote in his Code de la nature ou la véritable esprit de ses lois, forgive my French, wrote that his aim was to quote, in French, to distribute work according to capacity, products according to needs. The same idea, by the way, appears in as early as the Bible, the Old Testament, Acts 4:43 to. I got a typo in my book. Should be 33 to 35. I'll have to fix that. Anyway, it says there, neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. So that great idea, from each according to ability to each according to need, was around long before Karl Marx. And as I'll discuss, Karl Marx actually opposed implementing that idea until far in the future. The need to abolish buying and selling and the commodification of things. Gerard Winstanley also had words about that, which I'm not going to read now for the sake of limiting the time, but it's in my book. He also wrote about the need to abolish wage slavery, long before Karl Marx was born. The idea of international working class solidarity. Well, in the United States in 1676, Bacon's rebellion was a rebellion of international working class solidarity, in the sense that it was the descendants of Europeans and the descendants of Africans, people of African descent, who united together in that rebellion. But you can go back earlier, in 1524, 1525, there was the huge peasant revolt called the Great Peasants' War, or the Great Peasants' Revolt, in Europe, the part of modern Europe that would now be called Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Alsace, and the Czech Republic. All of these peasants were together in a rebellion in solidarity, which is working class solidarity. But we can go back even earlier to 73 BCE in the Spartacus Rebellion, in which there was this huge slave revolt against the Roman slave owners by the slaves from Thrace and from Gaul and probably other locations that the record doesn't explicitly name. So, let's not give Karl Marx credit for the idea of international working class solidarity. There's a great idea often attributed to Marx that the point is not merely to understand the world, but to change it. Well, Gerard Winstanley, who, by the way, he was one of the most articulate writers in the movement called the Diggers in England, which took over land and tried to make it used, by the peasants cooperatively, and they had a movement for all these wonderful ideas that didn't succeed, but it existed. And Gerard Winstanley, again born 1609, wrote, "Yet my mind was not at rest, because nothing was acted, and thoughts run in me that words and writings were all nothing, and must die, for action is the life of all, and if thou dost not act, thou dost nothing." So there we have, the point is not merely to understand the world, but to change it, long before Karl Marx. The idea of communism with a small c, meaning a classless society with social wealth held in common. John Ball led the English Peasant Rebellion in 1381, and he preached, quote, "Things cannot go right in England until goods are held in common, and there are no more villeins," that means the poor people, the peasants, "and gentlefolk, which means the aristocracy. But we are all one and the same. Well, there's your classless society idea. Now, what was the new idea that Karl Marx came up with? Well, he came up with what he called a science of Marxism. Now, I consider it to be a bogus science because it's based on a false premise. But the science of Marxism is that society will go from capitalism to socialism to communism because of laws that act on society as a result of the fact that he presumes, which I think is a false presumption, from the presumption that everybody acts in their self-interest. And the self-interest of people is determined by their relation to the means of production. So the self-interest of the capitalist is to get as much profit as possible and to keep wages low and cost of production low by not using resources to make the workplace healthy and safe and so forth, lowering wages. And the self-interest of the workers is the opposite, to get higher wages and have a more safe and workplace with more benefits and so forth. And so the self-interest of the workers and the self-interest of the capitalists are in conflict. And the Karl Marx's science is about how the changes in society that take place have nothing to do with the subjective aims of anybody at all, but are simply the result of changes that happen caused by people simply acting in their self-interest. So Karl Marx basically gave a little twist to the idea that Adam Smith famously invented, that goes by the name of the invisible hand. So Adam Smith's idea was that, and Adam Smith's point was that capitalism is the best of all possible worlds, because his idea was that even though the candlestick maker only makes candles to make a profit and has no particular interest in helping people light up the world, and even though the baker only bakes bread to sell for a profit and has no particular interest or aim in preventing people from being hungry, the result of people acting in their self-interest this way is that we have food and light, and in general we have a wonderful world because the invisible hand causes the acts motivated by self-interest to result in a better world for everybody. Well, Karl Marx gave a little twist to that idea. He kept the idea that there's an invisible hand that causes the actions motivated by self-interest to have an effect that is different from any actual subjective aim of the people who are acting in their self-interest. But the twist is, he said that the effect was to create a crisis in capitalism, which would then lead to socialism and then ultimately lead to a classless society. The fact is that Adam Smith and Karl Marx had a fundamental agreement that ordinary working class people were just motivated by selfishness, thought with their belly, had no subjective desire for a classless society and so forth, and were quite stupid. So let me just give you some words now. In Marx's Capital, his Das Kapital, if you want. He quotes Adam Smith, and approvingly, he says, the understandings of the greater part of men, says Adam Smith, this is Karl Marx writing, are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. And Marx goes on, and these are Marx's words now, quote, after describing the stupidity of the detail laborer, he, now Marx is referring to Adam Smith, goes on, and now he's quoting Adam Smith approvingly, quote, the uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. It corrupts even the activity of his body and renders him incapable of exerting his strength with vigor and perseverance in any other employments than that to which he has been bred. His dexterity at his own particular trade seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial values. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall. Okay, so the attraction of Marxism to many people, especially, I don't want to offend anybody, but especially to people who have a somewhat elitist, negative view of ordinary people, the attraction of Marxism is for people like this who want a classless society, to their credit, is that there is great hope in getting a classless society in spite of the fact that ordinary working class people do not want it. In spite of the fact that ordinary working class people are the way the left perceives them, which is extremely negatively, as selfish, in the different words for that selfishness that the left uses, racist, homophobic, complicit in the crimes of the ruling class that working class people supposedly support because they like getting loot from the rest of the world and so forth. The left is famous for its negative view of people. It views them as transphobic and bigoted in this way and that way, and the left's attitude towards ordinary people is not that they are the source of the positive values that ought to shape society, which is what egalitarians understand. The values of equality and mutual aid that are dominant among ordinary people in contrast to the capitalist values of greed and domination of the many by the few. No, according to the Marxists, these selfish, bad people will, because the working class is growing larger and larger, that's Marx's main point, will cause a crisis in capitalism, and that'll ultimately lead to socialism and ultimately lead to a classless society, in spite of the subjective desires and aims of ordinary people. So the famous phrase about from each according to ability to each according to need, well, let's see what Karl Marx actually thought about it. In the Gotha Program, this is where he introduces that famous phrase, and this is the paragraph where he basically says, it's a good idea, but not for the present, not even for the near future, but for the far future only. Quote, Karl Marx now saying, quote, in a higher phase of communist society, a higher phase, note, of communist society. Remember, communism only comes after socialism, only comes after the capitalism is ended. In a higher phase of communist society, shortly after the after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This is just false. It's not true that only then. Now, the reason Marx thinks that it could only happen then, in this far distant future, in the, quote, higher phase of communist society, after let me find it, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth. See, Marx's point is that the productive forces have to be increased so much that there is no longer any scarcity, because people will not share on the basis of from each according to ability, each according to need, until there is no scarcity, because people are selfish. And so you have to eliminate all scarcity first before people will ever think of sharing in a morally decent way. And so this idea of having to delay from each according to ability to each according to need until the far future stems from this negative view of ordinary people that is at the root of the Marxist science. It's the premise, it's the axiom of the science. And it's false. In Spain, it's called the Spanish Civil War. It ought to be called the Spanish Revolutionary War, or the Spanish Revolution. People who are essentially egalitarians, using the word anarchism as their ideology. That egalitarian movement basically controlled about half of Spain in the years 1936 to 1939, and in many parts of Spain they had eliminated money, and they had set up the economy on the basis of from each according to ability, each according to need, and they were well on the way to doing that in the places where it hadn't fully happened yet. And the economy, needless to say, in Spain in 1936 was hardly had hardly eliminated scarcity. It was primitive by our standards. And I will also add that you can read in my book, when they did take control, they vastly outproduced the capitalist production that in those regions that was in the years before the Spanish Revolution. So the point is that the communist, the Marxist science is profoundly wrong, and it has a profoundly negative, contemptuous view of ordinary people, and this is why the communist regimes are always totally anti-democratic. It's because in the communist Marxist theory, the Marxists have to be in control, not ordinary people, because it is only the Marxists, the Communist Party of the Marxists, who are subjectively aiming to create a classless society. And if ordinary people were allowed to have real say, then they would oppose the idea and the goal of a classless society. So this is the basis for the anti-democratic nature of communist regimes. Well, I think I have more to say about communism, but I think I'm going on too long now, so I'm going to call it an end here. I just want to point out at the very end that the idea of egalitarianism is to put ordinary people in the driver's seat, and that's why the idea is that the egalitarians, who are the vast majority of people in every local community, are invited to participate as equals in the local assembly of egalitarians, and that local assembly of egalitarians in the local community is the only body that can make laws that people in that community have to obey. The absolute opposite of the communist approach of having a central government controlled by a communist party that makes laws that everybody has to obey no matter what, in a totally dictatorial fashion. Okay, I hope you'll go to Amazon and take a look at these books of mine that you can buy, and that you will stay tuned for future videos. Thank you. Goodbye.